How could a home made of nothing but sheep's wool and wood keep a family alive at 50 degrees below zero, when that same wind, just beyond its thin felt wall, could kill an unprotected man in minutes? Picture it, a single white gur standing alone in an endless ocean of frozen grass, wind screaming across 1,000 miles of open steppe, and inside, wrapped in shadow and warmth, a child sleeping soundly through the storm. There are no forests here, no stone walls, no mountains, no piles of firewood stacked against the cold. And yet, night after night, families gathered around a small fire, shared warm meals, and slept while the world outside turned to ice. The secret was never simply about surviving the cold. It was about defeating something far more dangerous, something quieter and far more patient: the wind. Out here, Arctic air races unbroken across the flatlands, and at 40 below, a strong gust can make your body feel closer to 70 below, pulling the heat out of you faster than you can ever replace it. And the cruelest part is how gently it comes for you. Your fingers grow numb, your eyelashes freeze shut, then the pain fades, and a strange calm whispers that everything is fine, at the very moment your body begins to shut down. The Mongolian nomads understood a truth that modern science would only name centuries later. Survival was never about making more heat, it was about refusing to let heat escape. But that raises a far stranger question. How do you build one of the warmest homes on Earth in a land where almost no trees grow? And why did the people who mastered it leave behind no names at all? To answer that question, you first have to understand just how little the steppe gave its people to work with. There were 3 problems, and each one alone could be deadly. There was the cold and the wind that never stopped. There was almost no wood, no timber for heavy walls, no forest to burn through the winter. And there was the herd, always moving, which meant the family had to move with it, so a permanent house was never even an option. Everything had to travel, and so the answer came from the very animals that kept them alive. Sheep gave their wool, slender willow gave its poles, leather bound the frame together, and even the fire was fed by dried dung from the herd. From these humble things they built the ger, light enough for a few camels to carry, strong enough to stand against a screaming storm, and warm enough to hold a family through a night at 40 below. Think about what that truly means. An entire civilization, folded down and loaded onto a handful of animals, raised or taken apart in about an hour. This was not architecture that conquered the land the way stone walls do. It was architecture built for movement itself. These people never owned the land beneath them. What they owned was the ability to read it. Their home was anchored not to a place, but to knowledge. And much of that knowledge lived in a grandmother's hands, for she was the one who knew exactly how tight each leather strap should be pulled. Its strength began with a single perfect shape: a circle. Modern engineers know that a circle wraps the most living space inside the least surface, so less warmth ever leaks into the frozen air. And it solved the wind. A square building throws up flat walls that catch a gust head-on, and its corners become weak points where the storm begins to tear. The ger does something else entirely. The wind does not crash into it. It flows around it. Beneath the felt, expandable lattice walls called kana open into that perfect circle, while slender roof poles reach inward toward a central ring like the spokes of a wheel, all lashed together with leather instead of rigid nails. So when the gusts come, the frame does not fight them. It breathes with them, bending, holding, never breaking. Long before anyone spoke of aerodynamics, these nomads had already learned its deepest lesson. The strongest structure is not the one that resists nature. It is the one that lets nature flow around it. But a frame that bends with the wind still cannot save you from 40 below. Surviving that kind of cold demanded something more, something that could hold warmth in place. And the Mongols found it in the most ordinary material on the steppe: sheep's wool. Fresh wool was cleaned, dampened, rolled, and pressed until millions of tiny fibers locked together into dense sheets of felt, and hidden inside those sheets were countless microscopic pockets of air. Those pockets were the real secret, because still air is one of the worst carriers of heat there is, and trapped inside the wool, it slowed the warmth from ever reaching the frozen world outside. When winter deepened, families simply added more layers, until the walls grew 10, even 15 centimeters thick. Insulation they could adjust with the seasons in a way no stone house ever could. And the felt could breathe, letting the moisture of cooking and breathing pass slowly outward instead of freezing inside the walls, while the wool's natural oils shrugged off melting snow and kept the whole thing dry. Too thin, and precious heat escaped. Too sealed, and dangerous damp built up within. They had found the perfect balance centuries before science gave it a name. And at the very center of it all sat the fire. Not against a wall, but in the exact middle of the gare, so that heat radiated evenly in every direction, while warm air rose to the roof, and cooler air drifted back along the floor. A quiet, endless cycle with no fans and no machinery, just the laws of nature doing exactly as they were meant to. The fuel was humble too. Out here, firewood was far too rare to burn, so families relied on argol, dried dung from their own herds, which burned slow and steady with surprisingly little smoke. And here is the quiet miracle of it. The thing that kept a sleeping child alive through a night at 40 below was, in the end, animal dung. The most ordinary thing imaginable made almost sacred, because on the steppe, nothing is ever truly waste. Before sleep, the mother banked the fire down to glowing embers, never too large or she would waste what little fuel they had, never too small or the cold would win before dawn. Every night was a life or death calculation, solved by instinct alone. And notice what that fire truly was. With everyone seated around it, facing one another in a circle, the shape that held in the heat was the same shape that held them together. The warmth of the body and the warmth of belonging shared a single center. The fire was never only a source of heat, it was the heart. And yet holding the warmth inside solved only half the problem, because a sealed shelter can turn as deadly as the cold beyond it. Every breath, every meal, every burning ember releases moisture and smoke, and with nowhere to go, the air would grow damp and stale, until that trapped moisture froze inside the walls and quietly destroyed the very insulation keeping the family alive. So at the center of the roof, they placed a circular opening called the tonneau, and it worked as the lungs of the entire home, drawing smoke and damp and stale air up and out as the fire breathed beneath it. But it was never simply left open. A movable felt cover, pulled by ropes from inside, let the family widen it in calm weather and narrow it against a storm, tuning the flow of air by hand. Even the doorway had its purpose, kept low and facing south to shed less heat, turn its back on the northern wind, and welcome the weak winter sun through the short daylight hours. But the true genius reached beyond the felt walls entirely, because to these people, the land itself was part of the house. A low hillside could break the north wind. A shallow valley gave shelter without trapping the coldest air. An outcrop of rock became a windbreak, and a south-facing slope drank in the sun by day and gave a little of it back after dark. They read the snow, too, where the deep drifts marked sheltered ground, and the bare, wind-scoured patches warned of places the gusts never left. And in the pattern of grass and frost, they saw where the cold pooled, and where warmth quietly hid. And here is what most people never understand about that knowledge. It did not come from any book. It was collective memory, passed down through generations, and every reading of the snow was paid for in advance, because somewhere back through the years, a family had chosen the wrong ground and had not survived the winter to correct it. The child sleeping soundly tonight sleeps because ancestors once chose badly and were lost. That is the price this wisdom was written in. And so nothing here stood alone. The circle, the felt, the fire, the vent, the hill, the wind, and the people themselves were never separate things fighting the storm. They were a single living system, and remove any one piece and the whole begins to fail. Lose the insulation and the fire burns through its fuel too fast. Shift the stove and cold pockets bloom in the corners. Seal it too tight and the damp returns to rot the walls from within. These nomads never saw themselves as standing against nature. They saw themselves as one more part of it. So many ancient technologies vanished as the world moved on, replaced, forgotten, buried under the weight of progress. The Jur did not. For more than 1,000 years, its essential design has barely changed. Not because these people resisted new ideas, but because there was almost nothing left to improve. Even today, close to half of Mongolia's people still live in a ger for at least part of the year, and modern engineers and architects now study it as a model of passive design. A home that stays warm not through machinery, but through a deep and patient understanding of how nature actually works. What looks primitive turns out to be extraordinarily refined. And now we can finally answer the question we began with, the one that has waited quietly since the very first frame. Why did the people who mastered all this leave behind no names? Because their knowledge was never meant to belong to any single person. It belonged to the flow, passed from hand to hand, winter after winter, generation after generation. The home itself was their signature, a signature written not in ink, but in 1,000 winters of getting it right. Think back to that child, sleeping soundly while the storm screamed outside. That child grew up. And one day, with hands that remembered everything, raised a jar of their own, for a child of their own, sleeping soundly in the very same warmth. The circle closes, and the knowledge keeps flowing. Stripped down to almost nothing, this was only ever a ring of felt, a few wooden poles, and a small fire glowing at its heart. Yet, with those humble things, the Mongols never defeated winter by fighting it. They defeated it by understanding it. Some inventions grow obsolete. This one became timeless, and perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. The strongest civilization may not be the one that builds the highest walls, but the one that learns to bow to nature, and for that reason, never breaks. If this journey into the hidden wisdom of the steppe changed the way you see this quiet, remarkable home, consider subscribing, because history is full of ideas we dismissed as primitive, when in truth they were simply so perfect that we are only beginning to understand them now. And maybe the greatest discoveries were never the things we invented, but the ancient wisdom we walked right past,